Every single time you look at a screen, key information is designed to stick out. I want to sort of break down like what it means to make pixel art in a video game that's separate from just making pixel art. So let's go to the top examples from the last year, or at least let's go all time. Why be so constrained? Let's check out everything that there is. Here's a perfect example of some pixel art. It's definitely limited in its palette. It's definitely limited in its resolution to the point where you can see individual pixels. And it's using a shader, something you would see in a video game engine, used to make animated water. Now, we can see there are like very bright spots that are definitely still sort of like pixel art in that they are single pixel details. This is something that I would say is closer to what you would call like high bit pixel art, suitable for like modern video games. You can see that there are repeating layers that are being used. You can see that there is a static background. There are animations that loop. This idea of reusing pixels, of reusing assets to communicate what you're trying to do is like integral to pixel art. So a really good example of what you would call like a high bit pixel art. Now there are elements of this that I would say sort of break some of the principles of pixel art. You can see like this texture on the bottom, these seats. You can sort of get a little bit lost because there's almost like a gradient shadow on the seats that go down that you can't really appreciate at a pixel level. It may just be that the palette is really, really dense, but seeing this sort of like blur, I think detracts a little bit from the effect. This is not, in 2019, this is not about, especially if you're making games. So obviously my tutorial today is about pixel art specifically. Making games in 2019 is not about how pixel art your game is, right? You can obviously make multiple different kinds of games with varying amounts of commitment to that pixel art aesthetic. What matters is that it works, right? And in this case, I would say it does work. So making a good image, more important than making something that is true to some sort of pixel art, commitment. Another really great example of pixel art. You can see how limited the palette is, and you can see how here certain details are really, really only representable at the pixel level, right? This sign with this checkerboard pattern here, this is called dithering. And oftentimes in pixel art, we use this technique to average a color out. So the two colors, when dithered, when checkerboarded like that, gives you an impression of a color that sits in between those two colors. But here the example is actually, I think, to literally show you a checkerboard pattern on a sign. I think it's kind of interesting because it's sort of like very absolute in how it reads. Whereas these other parts here, you can see the colors are sort of more blended and natural. This image obviously is not something that you would really think would be suitable in a pixel art game, mostly because of the perspective and depth. When we talk about video games, especially for pixel art, the perspective is locked and is generally not one that is as continuously 3D. You generally never see lines that go from the horizon to the foreground, because if you needed to move the camera at all, how would you manipulate those lines? When we look at Super Nintendo games and back, the perspective is almost always fixed, right? In Mario Brothers, we have side-scrolling, so you're looking at 2D, you're side-on. A whole genre of platformers and games are based on this perspective, this fixed perspective. We have top-down examples where you're running left-right. There is depth, but it's not really true depth. The sprite is always the same size. You never see the sky, but at least you have freedom of movement on the ground. We have games like Fire Emblem. It's a little bit different. Here, this game sort of straddles two perspectives. You've got like the top-down in the map view, and then inside of battles, there are these side-on sprites. So you can, obviously video games are just software, so you can do whatever you want. And then we have isometric. So I got lucky there. I just sort of pasted some stuff and managed to end up with a nice gamut different perspectives. So isometric would be another one, which is somewhere between top down and side on. You know, you've got basically 4 different angles that everything could be positioned at as far as characters. Again, it's similar to top down, except you do get this sort of a little bit more depth, how you actually control a character and how you reuse graphics. Again, coming back to that idea. Video game graphics, for the most part, are very expensive to create and were most expensive to create in these times, back in before the 2000s. And so the idea of reusing, and you can see it here, I mean, with these 2 tents, you know, if this game was drawn with perspective, this tent would not look the same as this tent, which means they'd have to be drawn twice. The idea of the constraint of the actual platform, it kind of puts a fork, right, between pixel art that's just art and it's just supposed to be sort of the same as a painting, and pixel art that's used for an actual software, you know, purpose. Like, what else can we really think about when it comes to video games that would differentiate video game graphics from just art? A really obvious one that sticks out to me is so we've got input, but also communication. And I want to talk about this sort of in broad terms before I go too deep. So bear with me for just a minute. Video games, first and foremost, even though they're entertainment software. And when we look at video games, every single time you look at a screen, key information is designed to stick out, right? And it's no different, these design principles that you would call on are no different from if you were designing a website, a sign, or a flag, or any other kind of image that's for communication purposes. So when we talk about designing pixel art for a video game, things like color choices, how you style your game elements, are hugely important to how well that game plays and reads visually. I would say, here's a hot take. I don't think Mario stands out very well in this image. The shade of brown versus the sky, they blend almost too well. The red and green don't pair well together, and the silhouette's kind of muddy. Now, Mario's iconic. I'm not going to take shots at him. It's the only, the plus side is that this is the only red thing on the screen. Obviously, this is a part of a screenshot, so there's other things you would see on screen. But what's also important is not just the character, but the colors that are being used. I think this coin block stands out amazingly well. RubyWise says, would a black outline help Mario? That's exactly what I wanted to just talk about. There are a lot of techniques that have been developed over the course of video game pixel art to help highlight or isolate elements because those elements are more important. It's a prioritization exercise. When we talk about images, and specifically the readability of images, one of the most important things is really contrast. Coming back to that Atari example, the thing that is the most standout thing you could possibly draw would be a white rectangle on a black square. And in the context of Pong, it's super clear that this rectangle is here and not somewhere else. If you know that you're player 2 or whatever, and you're on the right-hand side, you never have a question about where your paddle is, right? Or where the ball is. Now, obviously, these sprites are so low res that you wouldn't be able to recognize that they were paddles necessarily. So if you were to look at this as a still image, you might not understand this is a video game, but that's a problem for 1960, not a problem for 2019. Why does this stand out so well? It stands out so well because it's high contrast. Your brain is designed to basically process images to find things that are different from other things. It's like object tracking. If I made this really, really low contrast, it's actually hard for you to look at, or it should be. It is for me, or even more shallow. This becomes really hard to look at. And when I'm working with low contrast pixel art, say I'm working on backgrounds, I find that I struggle. My eyes actually get really sore because they strain to tell the difference between the colors. And this isn't just a question of brightness. It can be a question of tone as well. If you have two colors that are have the same brightness and have the same saturation, but only slightly have different hues, those are equally difficult to tell apart, right? That might hurt your eyes as well, trying to find out the difference between this green and this blue. It hurts my eyes to look at. RubyWise says, as a very partially colorblind guy, it can be a struggle. That's right. And so this, very quickly, like red and green, typically, we talk about colorblindness, tend to be two colors that we think of as red and green as opposites, right? We think of this color, and we spoke about this before, right? We spoke about red, green, and blue as being like completely isolated in the spectrum and completely opposite each other. But what that means is that your brain processes them as equal. Full red and full green are both full, you know what I mean? So having them next to each other, even when you aren't colorblind, I find can be quite garish. The only difference is which parts of the cones and the rods look at them. But those cones and rods both pick up a full signal. So then your brain has to make a distinction between the kinds of things that it's looking at rather than the value of those things, which I think must be harder for some reason. But we won't go too far into it. What's important though is that from a usability standpoint, and if you were to make production software, you would know about this stuff. If you work on web design, legibility is hugely important. So outlines are one technique that we can use to basically draw a distinction between things. An outline's really handy, and it's an insanely popular technique in pixel art because of the following. Well, let's take Super Mario. Good example. Now, in later games, you can actually see the outlining becoming more relevant. Or Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES versus the original Super Mario Bros. Sprite. You can see they've actually started to incorporate those outlines to make Mario more distinct. Let's say we're looking at good old Super Mario Bros. I'm going to make a new layer in Sprite, and I'm just going to place a blue background behind Mario. Okay. Now Mario stands out well. You could probably find a color that Mario stands out really well here. In this case, the sprite is really bright. The background's really dark. So Mario stands out quite well. However, if I was to put Mario in a really bright scene, it becomes a little harder to look at, especially if we go towards those middle tones. Because Mario himself is sort of like more middle bright than fully bright. If we look at the brightness of his actual sprite, we look over here on the left-hand side, 60% brightness here. It's like 50% brightness on the red. So middle tones will be conflicting because they're the same brightness as Mario. However, if we were to give Mario an outline, and in ASprite that's really easy because you can just press Shift-O and get one. And you can make it a full outline or an outline that's just sort of going to miss those corners here. Let's use the one that's going to miss the corners here. You can imagine, a night sequence and a day sequence. You're still going to be able to see Mario very clearly because even in the day sequence where he's going to get drowned out, there's this barrier, right? This black outline that we've given Mario so that he's always in high contrast with what is right next to him. And as we talk about games with additional colors, and we've got underwater levels, and we've got lava levels, the outline gives us an easy way out to create contrast. That's one tool in video games that we use a lot of. So it's all about contrast, and I would say salience. So selective color, sometimes even selective shapes. So for example, if you have a game where the main character is a ball and all of the environment is made of squares, that would be another thing that stands out, that creates this idea of focus or priority. There are multiple ways of being able to isolate things on a screen. If you've played, and this is not a pixel art game, but if you've played Cuphead, there is a color that is only reserved for one purpose, and that is pink for parrying. Whenever there is something pink on the screen, you can jump on that thing to do like a parry attack. And so in a video game context, it's very useful because for the player, you just tell them, well, everything pink is parryable, and that's all they have to remember. There's no additional mental work that has to be done. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice.